The great halls of Valon Prime stretched endlessly, their crystalline walls shimmering with a soft golden glow, reflecting the presence of the most ancient and powerful beings in the galaxy. The Immortal Council had gathered once again, as they did every century, to discuss matters of war, diplomacy, and the future of the Galactic Union. They were the rulers of time itself, beings who had lived for thousands, some even tens of thousands of years. They had seen civilizations rise and fall, witnessed the birth and destruction of entire star systems, and prided themselves on the wisdom granted by their endless lifespans. To them, time was an ocean, and they were eternal waves that never crashed upon the shore. But today, among them stood a creature they considered an anomaly, an oddity that barely deserved acknowledgement. A human. Commander Elias Carter stood in the center of the Grand Chamber, his presence almost laughable against the towering figures around him. The Vexari, their smooth silver skin reflecting the golden lights, watched him with bemused expressions. The Drakesar, reptilian creatures with obsidian scales, whispered to each other, their glowing eyes filled with mockery. Even the Zorathians, a species of living energy encased in shimmering exoskeletons, pulsed with amusement. Carter could feel their judgment, but he remained still, hands clasped behind his back, his face an unreadable mask. He'd been sent as humanity's representative, but it was clear that the Council had little interest in what he had to say. Lord Ixatherian, the leader of the Vexari and one of the oldest beings in existence, stepped forward, his long robes flowing like liquid metal. "Commander Carter," he began, his voice carrying the weight of 10,000 years, "it is admirable that your kind seeks a place among us. But tell me, how does it feel to stand in the presence of eternity, knowing that your own life is nothing but a flicker in time?" The chamber echoed with soft laughter, a condescending melody that rippled through the air. Carter's gaze remained steady. He had expected this. The aliens had always looked down upon humanity, not for their intelligence, not for their capabilities, but for their mortality. To them, humans were fragile creatures, destined to wither away in the blink of an eye. Carter tilted his head slightly, a faint smirk forming on his lips. "I don't know," he replied. "How does it feel to waste 10,000 years and still accomplish nothing?" The laughter stopped. Silence fell over the chamber, heavy and suffocating. The air itself seemed to shift, the golden lights dimming slightly. Cytherian's expression remained calm, but there was something in his violet eyes, a flicker of irritation. Around the room, murmurs of discontent spread among the ancient beings. Humans were supposed to be respectful, humble in the face of superior species. They were not supposed to speak like this. Cytherian stepped closer, towering over Carter. "You misunderstand," he said, his voice colder now. "We have built empires that have lasted longer than your entire civilization. We have witnessed the birth of stars, mapped the unseen reaches of the cosmos, and shaped the very fabric of reality. Your kind, for all its ambition, will turn to dust before we have even finished a single meditation cycle." His words dripped with certainty, with the arrogance of a being that had never known the fear of time slipping away. The other council members nodded in agreement, their expressions filled with the same superiority. Carter let out a small breath, shaking his head slightly. "And yet, despite all your years, despite all your knowledge, you're afraid," he said, his voice steady. The chamber tensed. Cytherian's expression flickered with confusion, as did the others. "You sit here, claiming to be eternal, claiming to be wise, and yet your empire crumbles around you. The Corthan swarm is at your doorstep, burning your worlds, and you do nothing. Why? Because you are too afraid to risk your so-called immortality." His words cut through the air like a blade, sharp and undeniable. The Corthon swarm, the galaxy's greatest threat, a race of biomechanical monstrosities that consumed entire civilizations, had been advancing for decades. The Council, for all its wisdom, had done nothing but debate, too hesitant to engage in direct conflict, too fearful of losing their precious existence. Cytherian's jaw tightened. "We are not afraid," he said, but his voice lacked the same arrogance as before. Carter took a step forward, eyes locked onto the Vexari leader. "Yes, you are," he said. "You have lived so long that you've forgotten how to fight. You've forgotten what it means to take risks, to act. You hoard your years like misers hoard gold, too afraid to spend a single moment in real sacrifice. That is why you will lose. He let his words settle, watching as uncertainty spread across the faces of the ancient beings. For the first time, doubt seeped into the chamber. The council had always dismissed humans as insignificant, but now they saw something they had never understood before. Humans did not fear time. They did not cling to life like desperate creatures terrified of the abyss. They burned brightly, fiercely, unafraid of the darkness that awaited them. Where the council hesitated, humanity acted. Where the ancients sought preservation, humans sought meaning. And in that moment, Carter saw it, the realization creeping into their immortal minds. Perhaps lifespan was not the ultimate measure of worth. Perhaps eternity was not as powerful as they had believed. Carter exhaled slowly, turning away from them. "You call yourselves eternal," he said as he walked toward the exit, his voice echoing through the silent chamber. "But tell me, how long does it take for eternity to finally do something?" The doors closed behind him, leaving the immortal council to their thoughts. For the first time in thousands of years, they felt something they had long forgotten. Not superiority, not wisdom, but fear. The council chamber of Valon Prime was silent. The words of Commander Elias Carter still lingered in the air, haunting the immortal beings who had spent thousands of years believing they were the pinnacle of existence. For the first time in recorded history, they felt something foreign: uncertainty. The Korthan swarm was closing in, and despite their vast knowledge, despite their seemingly endless lifespans, they had done nothing. Time had made them careful, cautious, unwilling to risk their longevity in battle. But now, they had no choice. The enemy was relentless, consuming entire planets, tearing through fleets that had once ruled the stars. The Galactic Union had always considered humans insignificant, their short lifespans a weakness, their mortality a flaw. And yet, it was the humans who stood ready for war while the ancients hesitated. Carter sat alone in his quarters aboard the UNS Vanguard, a sleek, heavily armored warship stationed in the orbit of Valon Prime. He stared at the holographic display before him, analyzing the latest reports on the Korthan advance. The swarm had already destroyed 3 Union colonies in the past month, and still, the Council debated, unwilling to commit their forces. His jaw tightened. These so-called immortals had survived for thousands of years, but they had forgotten how to fight. Their fear of death had made them weak. Humans, on the other hand, had always known death. It lurked in the shadows of every battlefield, whispered in the ears of every soldier. But instead of running from it, humanity embraced it. They had learned to fight, not for survival alone, but for something greater, for the future, for those who would come after them. A sharp chime broke his thoughts. The door slid open, revealing Admiral Renza of the Zarathian High Command. Unlike the other council members, Renza had always been more open-minded toward humans. He was a towering figure, his crystalline exoskeleton pulsing faintly with energy as he stepped into the room. "Carter," he said, his voice deep and resonant, "the council is still deliberating." Carter exhaled sharply, shaking his head. "Of course they are. They have the luxury of time. They think if they wait long enough, the problem will solve itself." Renza hesitated before stepping closer. "You humans, you act so quickly, so recklessly. You throw yourselves into battles without fear, without hesitation. You burn so brightly, and then you are gone. I do not understand it." Carter leaned back, folding his arms. "That's the difference between us and you," he said. "You fear death because you think time is your greatest possession. You hoard it, stretch it out, try to make it last forever. But time isn't what matters. What matters is what you do with it." Renza watched him for a long moment, the glow within his exoskeleton shifting subtly. "And what is it that you humans do with your time?" he asked. Carter's lips curled into a small, knowing smile. "We fight. We build. We push forward, even when everything is against us. We don't live for ourselves. We live for those who come after us. That's why we don't hesitate. That's why we don't fear sacrifice. Renza's gaze flickered to the holographic battle plans on Carter's desk. "The Union fleets are stronger than yours," he said, "but you do not wait for them. You already plan your attack, even without their approval." Carter nodded. "Because waiting means losing. The longer we sit here, the more worlds we lose. Humanity has faced extinction more times than I can count, and every time we survive. Not because we lived long, but because we refused to stop fighting." He leaned forward, locking eyes with the alien admiral. Hesitated only for a second before clasping Carter's hand in his own. The decision had been made. Humanity would fight as they always had. And for the first time in millennia, the ancients would follow. The next day, the fleet of the Vanguard moved out, joined by those willing to stand against the Korthon threat. As Carter stood on the bridge, watching the stars stretch before them, he knew this battle would be brutal. Many would not return. But that was the truth of war, the truth of life itself. Immortality was a prison, but mortality was freedom. And humanity, fragile and short-lived as they were, had always known how to make the most of their time. The battle ahead would be fierce. The losses would be great. But humanity would endure. They always did. The stars above burned in eerie silence, but within that void, death moved swiftly. The Korthon swarm had arrived. Their ships, dark and insect-like, blotted out the light of distant suns as they descended upon the planet Valon Prime. For centuries, the Galactic Union had believed itself untouchable, its immortal rulers convinced that time was their greatest weapon. But today, time had run out. The swarm had come to devour them all. And standing against this unstoppable force was a fleet led by the one species the ancients had always underestimated: humans. Commander Elias Carter stood at the bridge of the Vanguard, his hands clasped behind his back as the enemy forces moved into position. His fleet was small compared to the massive armadas of the Union, but unlike the Immortal Council, he did not hesitate. The Union's fleet still lingered in orbit, waiting, fearful of risking their precious existence. Carter had no such fear. "All ships, prepare for combat," he ordered, his voice steady. The response was immediate. Human warships adjusted their formations, moving like predators ready to strike. They had done this before. Unlike the ancients, they did not rely on endless time to protect them. They relied on skill, strategy, and sheer determination. The first wave of Korthon ships surged forward, their organic hulls twisting unnaturally as they accelerated. Plasma fire erupted from their weapons, streaking across space in a storm of destruction. Human ships responded with brutal efficiency. Railguns roared, tearing through enemy hulls with precision, while missile barrages turned entire swarms into floating debris. The battle was unlike anything the Union had ever seen. The humans did not fight defensively. They did not retreat. They met the enemy head-on, pushing forward with relentless aggression. Carter watched as the Resolute, a destroyer on his right flank, took a direct hit. The ship's armor melted away, explosions ripping through its decks. But instead of pulling back, the Resolute charged forward, ramming its broken hull into an enemy cruiser, detonating in a blinding explosion that took down 3 Korthon ships with it. Admiral Renza, standing beside Carter, could only watch in shock. "Your people," he murmured, "they fight as if they do not fear death." Carter didn't look away from the battlefield. "Because we don't," he said. "We don't have the luxury of time like you do. We fight because we have no other choice." Renza had always thought of humans as reckless, but now he understood. They did not throw their lives away carelessly. They fought because they knew life was short, and that made every moment matter. The battle raged on, and for a time, it seemed as if the humans were holding their ground. But the Korthon swarm was endless. No matter how many ships were destroyed, more arrived to take their place. The Vanguard shook violently as enemy fire struck its shields, sending sparks flying through the bridge. "Damage report," Carter barked. "Shields at 30%, came the reply. Multiple hull breaches, but were still operational. Carter exhaled slowly. They couldn't win by fighting a battle of attrition. The Korthon would simply overwhelm them with numbers. They needed to change the battlefield itself. His eyes flickered to the planet below. Valon Prime was home to one of the largest energy reactors in the galaxy, a power source so vast it could alter gravitational fields. A dangerous plan formed in his mind. "Admiral, if we can overload the planetary reactor, we can create an energy surge strong enough to wipe out the swarm ships," he said. Renza's eyes widened. "That could destroy everything in orbit, including us." Carter gave a grim smile. "Only if we don't move fast enough." There was no time for debate. He opened a direct channel to all ships. "This is Carter. We are initiating the final strike. All ships, break off and reposition above the reactor coordinates. Prepare for immediate withdrawal on my command." There was no hesitation in the responses. The fleet shifted, accelerating toward the planet as enemy ships pursued. The reactor facility was already under attack, its defensive systems failing. Carter turned to his communications officer. "Get me ground command." A moment later, the screen flickered to life, revealing a battered human officer on the surface. "Commander, we're barely holding them back." The officer shouted over the sound of explosions. "We need you to initiate the overload sequence," Carter said. "Now." The officer's face went pale. "Sir, that'll kill everyone down here." Carter's jaw tightened. He already knew that. The soldiers on the ground had fought to give them this chance, and now they would ensure victory. There was a long pause. Then the officer gave a firm nod. "Understood." The transmission cut out. Carter exhaled, knowing what came next. Moments later, the planet trembled. The reactor, pushed beyond its limits, released a surge of energy so powerful it sent shockwaves rippling through space. The Corthon ships, caught in the blast radius, twisted and shattered, their organic structures unable to withstand the raw force. One by one, they detonated in brilliant bursts of fire and debris. The swarm was dying. The tide had turned. "Full retreat," Carter shouted. Human ships accelerated, barely escaping the growing destruction. The Vanguard pushed its engines to the limit, flames licking at its hull as it cleared the blast zone just in time. Then, silence. The Corthon fleet was gone. The humans had won. Carter sank into his chair, exhaustion washing over him. Around him, his crew erupted into cheers. But he did not celebrate. He thought of the soldiers left behind, the ones who had made the final sacrifice. They had given everything to ensure victory. Admiral Renza stared at the battlefield, his glowing form dimmed with realization. "This," he whispered, "this is why your kind will never be conquered." Carter looked at him, his expression unreadable. "Because we're willing to pay the price," he said simply. And in that moment, the immortals of the Union finally understood the secret of humanity. It was not their weapons, not their numbers, not even their intelligence. It was their resilience, their willingness to stand, to fight, to sacrifice, no matter the cost. This was the battle that changed everything. The Galactic Union had always believed that immortality was the ultimate achievement. To live forever, untouched by time, free from the decay that claimed lesser beings, that was the pinnacle of existence. For thousands of years, the immortal races had ruled the galaxy, watching empires rise and fall, civilizations burn to dust, while they remained eternal, unchallenged, and unshaken. They saw mortals as fleeting, fragile things, doomed to fade before they could ever matter. But all of that changed the day humanity arrived. Commander Elias Carter stood before the High Council of the Galactic Union, his presence an anomaly in a room filled with beings who had outlived entire star systems. He was young by their standards, barely 40 years old, yet there was something in his eyes, something that made even the oldest among them uneasy. He had seen war, death, and destruction, yet he stood unbroken. The council chamber was vast, its golden walls reflecting the soft glow of 1,000 ancient lights, yet it felt suffocating, as if time itself had grown stagnant here. The eldest of the immortals, Lord X-Cipher, leaned forward from his high seat, his crystalline form pulsing faintly. "Tell us, human," he said, his voice as smooth as drifting stardust. "Why do you fight so desperately? You live so briefly. What purpose does it serve?" Carter's gaze was steady. "Because we know something you don't," he said. We know what it means to live. A murmur spread through the chamber. Cypher's luminous eyes narrowed. And you believe we do not? Carter exhaled, shaking his head. You exist. You endure. But you don't live. The words sent a ripple of unease through the council. For thousands of years, no one had dared speak to them this way. We have seen the rise and fall of 1,000 species, Cypher countered. We have built wonders beyond your imagination. And yet, you, a creature whose lifespan is but a flicker, would lecture us on life? Carter stepped forward, his voice unwavering. You've lived for so long that you've forgotten why life matters. You fear death so much that you refuse to risk anything. You hoard your years like a dragon hoards gold, but what do you do with them? You sit in these halls. Cypher stared at him, silent for a long moment. Then, with an almost imperceptible motion, he gestured, and a holographic projection appeared in the air above them. It showed the battlefield of Valon Prime, where the humans had fought the Korthan swarm. Carter had led that battle, alongside other mortal species who had been abandoned by the Immortals. The projection replayed the moment when the humans had chosen to sacrifice an entire colony to overload the planetary reactor, wiping out the swarm's invasion fleet. The Council had watched in horror as thousands of human soldiers had willingly stayed behind, knowing they would never leave that battlefield. Even now, Cypher could not understand it. You could have fled, he said. You could have retreated and saved yourselves. Instead, you chose death. Carter's jaw tightened. No, we chose victory. We chose the future. His eyes burned with something the Immortals could not grasp. You think immortality makes you strong, but it has made you cowards. You fear loss so much that you refuse to fight for anything. You let others suffer because you won't risk your eternity. But he gestured toward the projection, to the men and women who had died to stop the swarm. We don't fear death, because we know our time is short. And that's why we are stronger than you. Silence fell over the chamber. The Immortal Council members looked at one another, their once arrogant expressions shifting into something else, something close to doubt. They had always believed that time itself made them superior. But Carter had exposed the truth they had refused to face. Immortality had made them stagnant. They had stopped evolving, stopped creating, stopped pushing forward. They had grown complacent, watching from their thrones while the mortals shaped the galaxy with their blood and sacrifice. For the first time in thousands of years, the Immortal Council was afraid not of death, but of the realization that they had wasted their existence. You think we are cowards? Exa finally said, his voice quieter now. Perhaps you are right. He turned his gaze to the projection of the battlefield, watching the final sacrifice of the human soldiers. And yet, I do not understand. If you know that you will die, if you know that all you build will one day be dust, then why fight at all? Why struggle? Carter gave a small, almost sad smile. Because life isn't about how long you live. It's about what you do with the time you have. His voice was steady, but it carried the weight of every fallen soldier, every lost friend, every sacrifice humanity had made. Immortality means nothing if you do nothing with it. The council chamber remained silent long after Carter had left. For the first time in their endless existence, the Immortals were forced to confront a truth they had long ignored. Immortality was not strength. It was a prison. And humanity, the short-lived, fragile species they had dismissed, had become something greater than they had ever been. Because humans, more than any other species, understood the true meaning of life. And that truth had changed everything. The grand archives of the Galactic Union stretched endlessly, filled with the recorded history of countless civilizations. It was a place where time had no meaning, where knowledge was preserved beyond the reach of decay. Yet, for all its vastness, there was one section that remained a mystery to most, the Hall of the Fallen. It was not dedicated to the immortal races who had ruled for millennia, nor to the ancient empires that had once spread across the stars. No, this place was dedicated to a species that had long since vanished, humans. Cypher, an elder of the Union, moved silently through the hall, his crystalline form reflecting the dim light of the archive. His kind had ruled the galaxy for ages, But there was one thing they had never understood: why mortals, beings with such brief lifespans, had left a mark that even time could not erase. The immortals had outlived countless civilizations, yet it was humanity's legacy that endured in ways no one could explain. He approached a central pedestal, where a simple inscription stood, carved into metal. It was a message left behind by a dying human admiral centuries ago. We were never meant to last forever. But what we build, what we fight for, what we leave behind, that is what matters. Cypher traced a hand over the words, feeling a strange weight in his chest. Humanity had been gone for over 1,000 years. They had not conquered the stars with numbers. They had not relied on immortality. And yet, their influence remained in ways that defied reason. The Union's greatest technological advancements, their military strategies, even their understanding of leadership, all had been shaped by the short-lived species that had burned so brightly before vanishing. But why? He turned to a nearby archive panel, activating a holographic projection. It flickered to life, showing footage from the final battle of humanity, their last stand against the Devourers, an unstoppable force that had consumed entire star systems. The immortal races had fled, unwilling to risk their endless existence against an enemy that could not be reasoned with. But the humans had stayed. They had fought with everything they had, knowing they would not survive. Their fleets, though smaller, had engaged the Devourers head-on, not in the hope of victory, but to buy time for other species to escape. It had worked. Billions had survived because of them. But not a single human had made it out alive. Cypher watched in silence as the battle played out once more. He saw the human commander, a woman named Admiral Evelyn Drake, standing on the bridge of her burning warship, issuing her final orders with unwavering resolve. She had known the cost, but she had never hesitated. "We are not fighting for ourselves," she had said. "We are fighting for those who will come after us." Those words had echoed across history. The species that humanity had saved had gone on to thrive, to build new civilizations, to push the boundaries of knowledge. But the humans themselves had been lost to time. Their cities were now ruins, their homeworld a silent graveyard. Yet, in some way, they had never truly died. Their ideas, their courage, their sacrifices, those had lived on. Cypher had seen it in the younger races that now filled the Union. They did not fear death the way the immortals did. They lived with purpose, knowing their time was limited, and because of that, they accomplished more in a single lifetime than the ancients did in 1,000 years. For so long, the immortals had believed that their endless existence made them superior. They had watched the universe change around them, believing themselves above the struggles of mortals. But now, standing in the Hall of the Fallen, Cypher wondered if they had been wrong all along. The humans had never feared death. They had embraced life. They had fought not for themselves, but for a future they would never see. And in doing so, they had shaped the galaxy in ways no immortal ever had. A soft voice broke his thoughts. "Elder Cypher." He turned to see a young scholar, a member of a newer race that had risen after humanity's fall. She looked at him with curiosity. "Why do you always return here?" He looked back at the inscription, at the words left behind by a species long gone. "Because I am trying to understand," he said quietly. "They were not the strongest, nor the oldest. And yet, their legacy remains." The scholar stepped forward, gazing at the holographic projection of Admiral Drake. "Perhaps that is the answer," she said. "Perhaps mortality itself is what gave them purpose." Cypher considered this for a long moment. He had always believed that immortality was the greatest gift. But now, as he stood surrounded by the echoes of a species that had burned brightly and vanished, he began to wonder if it had truly been a gift at all. The humans had known that their time was short, and because of that, they had never wasted a single moment. They had loved fiercely, fought bravely, and built things meant to outlive them. And in the end, that was why their story had never truly ended. As Cypher left the Hall of the Fallen, he carried a new understanding with him. The immortals had always believed that time made them invincible. But humanity had proven that it was not time that shaped the universe, it was those willing to fight for a future they would never see. And that, more than anything, was the true legacy of mortals.